big plans for the upcoming holiday weekend. He was super excited to take part in all the activities of the July 4th holiday. Fireworks, displays, barbecues, and outdoor activities, including swimming and volleyball on the beach. Eric was employed as a sous chef at a very popular seafood restaurant in the small resort town of Sandy Isle in the coast of South Carolina. Eric had been employed at the restaurant for less than a year, and this was his first opportunity to enjoy the summer fun with 3+ days off. Eric was pumped. Yes, he thought. I'll be enjoying the weekend off while my co-workers are sweating away in the kitchen. The restaurant manager decided to close early that day to allow the employees a few hours respite from work before the onslaught of tourists arrived the next morning. Eric was on a mini vacation at closing time today, so he was even more excited to close early. Eric thought to himself, let's get this party started. However, time was dragging today. As he repeatedly looked up at the clock, the hands seemed to move slower and slower as if they were mocking him in deliberate defiance of his eagerness to leave. Eric, who usually drove his car or rode his bicycle to work, decided that day he would walk. He thought to himself, I'll avoid the holiday traffic and some gas too. I'll take the shortcut by the graveyard and I'll be home to meet up with Annie in less than 10 minutes. Yes, this will be a lot better than being stuck in traffic. And I can change before Annie gets there. A voice from the dining room called out to Eric. This brought his mind back to where he was and interrupted his daydreaming. Eric, we got one more order. Can you stick around for just 10 more minutes? Eric was internally perturbed by this request, but on the exterior he smiled and shot back. No worries, I got you covered. It appeared that Eric was going to get held over for just a little while longer. That little while actually turned into hours. The moon was full and bright that evening. A smooth breeze swept over the town. Eric finally finished his shift. He quickly cleaned his station before taking out the trash. Bless you, the time was 8:45 p.m. He must be allergic to our dogs. This reality put a spring in Eric's step as he started his walk home from the restaurant. The cool ocean breeze was blowing softly through the town. His walk was well lit by the ambient glow of a full moon. This trip on foot took Eric down the street where the town's old cemetery was located. Eric approached the gates of the cemetery. Something about the atmosphere that night felt unsettling to him. He noticed that the gates were open and unlocked. He thought to himself, it's after sunset, why aren't the gates locked? Eric took it upon himself to close and lock the gates. He was hoping that someone didn't break into the cemetery and vandalize any of the headstones that were there. As he continued on his journey, his thoughts were disrupted by a strange noise coming from inside the cemetery. Eric could hear what sounded like a child giggling. Hello, who's there? Are you okay?
Don't do it.
Eric shouted as he moved closer to the gate that separated the living from the dead. He tried to focus in on an area where he thought the sound came from. Eric stood patiently waiting for a reply, but there wasn't a response. He took a few steps forward, but then he had his focus taken back to the cemetery when he heard a soft-pitched voice humming and singing. Eric returned to the gate again. This time he was quite agitated and angrily called out, Hello, you can stop screwing with me now already. The fun's over. Eric assumed that some local kids were fooling around in the cemetery and his impatience to get home. He didn't see the humor in this at all. Cut it out, punks. I know you're in there fooling around. I'm going to call the cops when I get home, Eric shouted to whomever was hiding in the shadows of the cemetery. He stood firm on the sidewalk and glared into the darkness. Absolute silence followed his stern warning. Eric thought, well, I guess I showed them, as he puffed out his chest and exhaled, and turned to continue on his walk. His concentration was broken by something he didn't expect to see emerge from the shadows. For him, on the other side of the gate, stood a dark-haired figure leaning against a distorted tree. The individual appeared to be quietly sobbing, shrouded in the shadows. This person appeared to be a small female with long, dark hair. She was wearing what appeared to be an old, dingy white gown that was tattered and smudged with dirt.
Run.
Eric took a moment to catch his breath. He was taken aback by the peculiar sight of this girl, appearing out of thin air in the graveyard. Eric cleared his throat and swallowed hard, only to be left with a dry mouth. He called out, Hello, miss, are you hurt? The girl said nothing. She remained still and continued to weep. Eric was starting to unravel. He had been by this graveyard more than 1,000 times, and he had never experienced anything like this. His lungs tightened, making it difficult to breathe. His hands were shaking and wet with perspiration. His head began to throb. Excuse me, miss, are you okay? Do you need help? Eric said aloud. The girl refused to acknowledge his query, and he was increasingly agitated by her unwillingness to reply. Hello, are you deaf, girl? Do you freaking understand me? I'm trying to help you, Eric shouted as he placed his hands on the iron rods of the gate. Eric looked around the area where she was standing. The grave directly in front of him had a pile of toys, cards, toy necklaces, stuffed dolls, and candy draped all over it. Eric smacked the gate as he called out to her again, but he was quickly stifled by her response. The mystery girl emerged from the shadows, moving like a marionette and facing away from him. Slowly she sauntered toward the gate, awkwardly walking backwards until she was in front of Eric. His throat tightened and the hairs on his arms stiffened and stood erect. The girl moved closer and started to turn to face Eric. He gasped. He couldn't breathe. He was now face to face with this menace of the night, that he was scared to death at this point. He trembled uncontrollably as he looked into the girl's eyes. To his shock, her eyes were not present. Only vacant pits of black remained. Matted hair framed her pale face. The girl opened her mouth to speak. However, there were no words, no sound. Only the stench of death poured from her mouth. Eric grabbed his chest as to keep his heart from bursting. He let out a voiceless scream as he jumped back from the gate. His legs were weak from this frightful encounter, and he stumbled and fell from the sidewalk onto the street behind him. The headlights of a passing car immediately blinded him. The vehicle came to a screeching halt to keep from hitting Eric. "What are you trying to do? Get yourself killed?" shouted the driver from her open driver's side window. After taking a second look, the driver called out to Eric in disbelief. "Eric, is that you? What are you doing on the ground? You're supposed to be home already." Eric quickly realized who was talking to him. Thankfully, Annie, his girlfriend, was the one driving down the same street just as he was face to face with one of the most terrifying encounters of his life. "Annie, we need to go now!" Eric shouted. He stumbled repeatedly as he ran to get to her passenger door. He slammed the car door on his foot upon the first attempt to shut the door and uttered a few profanity-laced expletives. "Go, go, go!" Eric screamed. Annie floored the gas pedal without hesitation. Eric's stomach started to churn as he turned to look back at the cemetery. Annie pulled her car into a well-lit parking lot of a nearby gas station. She put the car in park as Eric threw open the passenger car door so he could vomit. "What's wrong with you?" Annie inquired. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Eric wiped his puke-soiled mouth with his sleeve and explained his encounter to Annie. Eric always cared for Annie. He loved her for as long as he could remember. He shared his story with her without a second thought. "Eric, I believe you. I've lived in this town since childhood. I've seen things in that graveyard that I can't even explain." Without saying a word, Annie reached for Eric's hand. She pulled him closer to her and attempted to kiss him. Eric backed away slightly. "Annie, babe, I just puked, remember?" Annie chuckled as her eyes met him again. She moved in for a second time and kissed his vomit-tainted lips. "Eric, I love you, vomit mouth and all." Their brief moment together was interrupted suddenly. Eric went into a state of panic. He was grabbing each pocket to double-check where he put his phone, but came up empty-handed. "My phone! I don't have my phone! I must have dropped it when I fell into the street. Annie, I'm sorry, we gotta go back. What if that witch or demon or whatever it was gets it and finds out who I am?" Annie grabbed Eric's hand in order to settle him down and agreed to go back there so they could retrieve his phone.
"You guys are stupid.
Idiots, just tell the company to shut off your phone."
Eric sighed as he traced his hand along her lacy scarf.
I know.
They got back into the car and headed back into the direction of the cemetery. They stopped near the spot where Eric had been. Annie turned on her headlights on the high beam. She grabbed Eric's hand and said, "I have a flashlight in the back floorboard." Eric grabbed the flashlight and said to Annie, "Come on, let's find this freaking thing together. Are you up for it, Annie?" He said with a forced smirk. They got out of the car and shuffled their feet as they approached the exact spot where Eric came face to face with this demonic-looking apparition. Eric, with Annie's flashlight in hand, needed to scour the area looking for his phone. He was hoping to avoid the spirit that caused him to lose his cool. He wasn't about to give up until he found his phone. Eric had heard stories from various townspeople of strange encounters in this exact graveyard. He had always dismissed these tales as simply ghost stories or legends handed down through the years. This was different from everything he has ever heard before. It wasn't a figment of his imagination. He saw something. Usually, Eric would just laugh and shrug it off as supposed ghost stories of encounters in the old graveyard. But what he experienced that night would forever change his opinion. "Eric, what is that?" Annie whispered. Eric pointed the flashlight toward the tree where he first saw the ghostly figure. "Holy shit! This is the grave with all the toys and other stuff covering it. Look at it, Annie." "Those items in that grave are scattered everywhere," Eric shouted aloud. It looked as if something or someone had tossed toys, seashells, cards, everything all around the area. "Annie, these were covering the dead girl's grave earlier. When I saw that girl in the white, I noticed the grave was covered with stuff. What did I see?" Annie was standing close to the fence line. She placed her hands along the rails. "What is that?" she said aloud. The headlights to Annie's car shut off. Eric quickly turned to look at the car to see what was blocking the lights. He slowly walked toward the car, and the headlights turned back on, brighter than before. "Annie, I think your alternator might be going bad. The lights keep flickering," Eric said to her as he returned to face her. To his surprise, Annie was no longer standing at the fence. "Annie! Annie, where are you, babe?" Eric called out in desperation. He lifted the beam of his flashlight to check the area where she had been standing. He ran to the fence line and used his flashlight to canvass the area in the hopes of finding where Annie may have wandered off to. He was beginning to get really worried about where she was. "Annie, where are you?" Eric cried out again. He could hear muffled screams coming from the decorated grave. Eric's heart dropped to his stomach when he panned the ground along the grave and saw Annie's lacy scarf. Her scarf was sticking halfway up out of the ground. Annie's muffled screams grew softer and softer. "Annie! Annie!" Eric cried as the scarf was no longer visible and sunk all the way beneath the earth. As the breeze started to shake the tree branches around him, the laughter of the ghost girl billowed through the air.
Frankie!